Life is not easy. But that's something we already know, isn't it? How we live in a world that constantly reminds us that life itself is simply unfair. Having many of us clinging onto this delusion that everything should go our way, tormenting ourselves with the hopes that one day we would see the world differently after overcoming a trial of struggles and hardship, a day that will never come. Except when we find ourselves struggling with our own challenges, we find ourselves falling into a dark place, trying to navigate our way through a realm of misery, rage, and sadness, trying to find guidance, to reach out for someone, anyone who's willing to help us through this world of darkness, until we find a helping hand. A selfless act from someone who carries us from this darkened world of ours and helps us into the light. It's interesting how we fear the monsters that are hidden in the dark, and yet many of us never realize how those who are there to guide you into the light are the kind of monsters that would love to see you burn. Today's story, my friends, brings us to the house of Santo Shingeki. Within this luxurious home resides a father and a daughter, Mr. Shingeki, his daughter Mayumi, and the staff who tends to the house and the owner's needs. Now, even though Mr. Shingeki is very well known for his wealthy status and being a man who's well respected for what he does, however, the life that resides within the walls of this house is anything but peaceful. In fact, it's a chaotic struggle because of his daughter's condition. You see, as a result of her mother's death, Mayumi has been suffering from an extremely rare mental disorder that results with her being unable to decide her next action. Even though Mr. Shingeki had tried finding professionals for his daughter, unfortunately none were successful in helping her. Some didn't believe that Mayumi was struggling with a mental disorder. Some advised the idea of having her put on medication, and some even tried convincing Mr. Shingeki to have her admitted into a psychiatric ward. Obviously, these were ideas that Mr. Shingeki refused to accept. So far, the only thing that this father can do for his daughter is the maids and staff who are given the unbearable task of tending to her every needs. As a result of this, many of the staff have resigned because of the tedious and exhausting efforts of having to guide Mayumi through every choice that comes her way. Even when having the maids work in rotating shifts, it still wasn't enough to save his daughter from the tremendous pain of being unable to make her own decisions. So out of desperation, to seek help from anyone, Mr. Shingeki placed an ad for someone who has the experience, credentials, and most importantly, the tolerance to help his daughter through her condition. For obvious reasons, many have declined the position, regardless the amount of money Mr. Shingeki was willing to pay. And for a while, Mr. Shingeki thought all hope was lost, until a strange woman known as Miss Mitsu responded to the ad. Regardless of the fact that Miss Mitsu had no credentials, nothing known about her background other than her enthusiasm to help people through struggles and trauma, it was after the brief interview, watching Miss Mitsu immediately tending to Mayumi, and when taking on the unbearable task of guiding Mayumi through the entire day until night. Normally, this isn't the proper methods of hiring someone to help Mayumi. But seeing Miss Mitsu's enthusiasm and endurance in guiding his daughter, seeing Mayumi experience a normal life, Mr. Shingeki was a father who was so desperate, he had this belief that Miss Mitsu will succeed in helping his daughter, which is why she was hired. The weeks that followed, Mr. Shingeki began seeing a huge improvement with Mayumi's condition. According to the security cameras, Miss Mitsu's efforts was definitely showing. Every day Miss Mitsu would come in at 8 in the morning and leave in the late hours at night after Mayumi fell asleep. It's admirable how someone can work this hard without breaking. Of course, much like Mr. Shingeki, many of us would see Miss Mitsu as a godsend, a saint for what she was doing for Mayumi. Except, there were a few concerns, things that were beginning to show. It's been a month already, and yet Mr. Shingeki still knows very little to nothing about Miss Mitsu. Nothing about her past jobs, her friends and family, Nothing about her personal life other than the fact that she had mention of being married, which is a bit concerning seeing how this job must be taking a toll on her marriage because of the long hours. Then her complexion. Even though Miss Mitsu has shown nothing but endurance for her job, the long days and exhausting task of guiding Mayumi was starting to show. Indeed, Miss Mitsu's passion was beyond normal. Right when Mayumi would wake up in the morning till she would fall asleep at night, Miss Mitsu would be there, guiding her throughout the day. Every day. Everywhere. It was almost like they were inseparable. Something else that Mr. Shingeki began noticing. Something that was a bit odd, eccentric if you want to call it, was how Miss Mitsu would start using hand signs to guide Mayumi, even begin moving closer to Mayumi's ear and whispering the faint orders. But seeing his daughter's improvement, being able to go outside and perform things such as shopping or eating at a restaurant without a hitch, Mr. Shingeki didn't think anything of these concerns, knowing that very soon his daughter Mayumi will once again be able to live her life independently. And even though Mr. Shingeki had tried convincing Miss Mitsu to take a small break, a couple days to relax, Miss Mitsu would always respond to Mr. Shingeki's concerns by explaining her love and passion for the job, that something about this job allows her to return to her past self, and that seeing Mayumi happy makes her truly happy. And maybe Miss Mitsu does love this job, even though it has taken a toll on her. Like any other hard worker, maybe these concerns were nothing to worry about. But on one night, when thanking Miss Mitsu for her efforts, that's when Mr. Shingeki saw another concern, that there's something not right with Miss Mitsu when noticing the bruises on her face. Something that Miss Mitsu would deny and refuse to acknowledge. And after seeing that was when Mr. Shingeki had his assistant secretly open an investigation on Miss Mitsu. 2 months since she was hired. Mr. Shingeki and the staff were uneasy with Miss Mitsu's bizarre methods of guiding Mayumi. Oh yes, her enthusiasm and devotion was beyond describable, but to a certain degree to where people were now starting to be concerned for her well-being. And even though Mr. Shingeki tried several times to convince Miss Mitsu to take a rest, that Mayumi's condition had improved so much that it would not falter if Miss Mitsu were to take a couple days off. But her persistence to help Mayumi remained unfaded. And yes, Mr. Shingeki thought about forcing Miss Mitsu to take a break. But seeing his daughter living out her life without having to struggle with making choices, for some reason Mr. Shingeki felt that tampering with this relationship between Miss Mitsu and his daughter may not be a wise decision. And even though there was something unsettling about all this, something that was giving Mr. Shingeki this crazy idea that there was something sinister with Miss Mitsu, it was after hearing about a tragic accident, Mr. Shingeki found himself dismissing these thoughts, and have come to embrace Miss Mitsu in her extraordinary efforts. It's hard to explain, but you see, a couple of days ago, there was a crash. A truck driver who had lost control of his vehicle and accidentally injured several pedestrians. That day, both Mayumi and Miss Mitsu were at the scene. If you think about it, knowing how Mayumi wasn't able to make her own decisions, if it wasn't for Miss Mitsu, well, Mr. Shingeki may have lost his daughter that day. Admirable? Yes. And Mr. Shingeki may have dismissed these concerns with Miss Mitsu, except there was still that feeling. Something about all this that is not right. Even though he'd forgotten about it, it was a smart idea when Mr. Shingeki had his assistant do a background investigation on Miss Mitsu. And after what was found, Mr. Shingeki should be very concerned. It took some time, a lot of effort, but just enough to get a general idea of the woman known as Uchida Mitsu. First off, Miss Mitsu does not have any credentials, training, nor experience with helping or assisting those who struggle with trauma or any other mental illnesses. Also, she is not married. Instead, she lives downtown in a duplex with her boyfriend Aga, who has a criminal record for thievery, assault, drug abuse, etc., etc., but most importantly, he's unemployed. Basically, Aga has been living off Miss Mitsu. It's because of him that she applied for this position under the pretense of being a professional, and why she's been forced to work so that he could squander off her earnings. According to the neighbors and witnesses, Aga would usually resort to violence because of his temper, which explains the bruises on Miss Mitsu's body. Basically, Miss Mitsu feels powerless against Aga. And Mr. Shingeki, standing there silently as he took in the shocking news. It is strange how Miss Mitsu is able to take good care of his daughter, knowing how unfortunate her personal life truly is. Yes, Miss Mitsu may be going through a rough time, but right now, Mr. Shingeki is not concerned for Miss Mitsu's personal life. You see, after learning about this information, Mr. Shingeki's greatest concern right now, if this were to become a problem, something that's left to fester, what if this Aga starts targeting his daughter? Yes, Mr. Shingeki does want to see Miss Mitsu get the help that she needs, but knowing the connection between her and his daughter, the question is, how? How can you get somebody like Aga away from Miss Mitsu? For the sake of his daughter, there must be something that Mr. Shingeki can do about Aga. Two weeks later, tragedy had struck when Miss Mitsu was found dead, naked within her own apartment. Her entire body was literally filled with bruises, cuts, and scars. According to forensics, she was beaten to death. They also noted her frail appearance, which was prior to her death, possibly from previous injuries. A few witnesses claimed that when Miss Mitsu was last seen alive, they remember seeing her ex-boyfriend, Aga, entering and leaving the residence. Even though they've known about the abusive relationship, and what little the authorities did when Aga's abuse had gotten out of control, there was some relief when they remember seeing Aga leaving the apartment after being confronted by a stranger. Not sure what the discussion was about, but whatever it was, it had to be the reason why Aga came back a few days later and become the primary suspect to Miss Mitsu's murder. When Mr. Shingeki learned about what happened to Miss Mitsu, immediately he began to panic, filled with so much regret that his attempt to resolve the situation had only made matters worse when knowing that Mayumi will be without Miss Mitsu's guidance. Fearing that everything Miss Mitsu had done for his daughter was all for nothing, that this tragic event would result with Mayumi falling back to her illness once again. And one would think that all hope was lost for Mayumi. Except when Mr. Shingeki rushed to his daughter's room to tell her the shocking news, he did not expect to find his daughter in a state of calmness, not overwhelmed with her inability to make her own choices, but more shockingly, Mayumi believed that Miss Mitsu was still alive, still behind her, guiding her and whispering into her ear. Something that Mr. Shingeki will never forget is when Miss Mitsu had said, "This job allowed me to return to my past self, allowing me to relive my past lifestyle." When he first heard those words, Mr. Shingeki never understood what Miss Mitsu meant, until after learning how she was forced to work successfully by her boyfriend Aga and having to guide Mayumi to live and experience a normal life. Seemed like more of the idyllic life for Miss Mitsu. Even though Miss Mitsu wasn't there, Mayumi still continued on her day as if Miss Mitsu was still at her side, whispering into her ear. Not sure if this was his daughter's imagination, or if Miss Mitsu was somehow projecting her spirit to guide Mayumi. But the strangest thing is if you were to pay close attention, listen carefully, you could still hear the faint whispers surrounding his daughter. But no matter what, Mr. Shingeki is beyond grateful for what Miss Mitsu had done. And even beyond the grave, she's still somehow guiding Mayumi into a normal life. A normal life, indeed. Of all the red flags we've seen, I bet many of us are wondering how a man like Mr. Shingeki could just simply dismiss these concerns. Of course, he does have his reasons. A man so desperate to see his daughter live a normal, healthy life, willing to do whatever it takes for Mayumi to be free from her mental illness. But you know something? How many people do you see in today's world who easily dismiss the warning signs when somebody's lending a helping hand? Who's willing to help them through their struggles, to pick them back up on their feet again, not knowing that they could care less if you fall down again and break. That day, when Mr. Shingeki found his daughter in the garden, stabbing the ground, under the pretense that Miss Mitsu was still guiding her, I think that's when Mr. Shingeki finally realized something was terribly wrong. Later that night, after Mayumi had disappeared for 6 hours, that was when Mr. Shingeki would realize the terrible consequences of his actions when Mayumi returned home at midnight, covered with blood. What happened is that Mayumi had managed to find Aga and killed him. It's what Miss Mitsu had been teaching her this whole time. I bet some of us were expecting a happy ending. No, my friends, just a tale of terror that leaves us with a valuable lesson. Even though Mayumi wasn't sent to prison for murder, unfortunately her chances of living a normal life was now gone. Now she lives her life in a psychiatric ward, under constant supervision, and taking medication to decrease this delusion that someone is whispering into her ear. As I said, my friends, a helping hand within a darkened place can bring you towards an unremitting horror, like a moth to a flame.